Hello, I wanted to make a video that walks you through a couple of the practice problems on phylogenetic trees, cladograms, evolutionary trees, call them what you will. I've been receiving a few questions that it might be helpful to go over them, and I wanted to help you if I can. So the first thing I've tried to do today, it is Monday, September 28th, is first the update not the answer, but an answer to practice problem number one. And I'm using the article "and" specifically because we're not trying to come up with the answer. Your answer might be different. We're trying to generate an answer that makes sense based upon the available evidence. So I'm hoping this updated tree is a little bit more clear than the previous one that I had made. Again, not because this is the answer that you're trying to go for, but it's an answer that hopefully makes sense. So, just quickly, we can see that there are a couple of ancestral characteristics that are being shared amongst most of the species in question. That there are some derived characteristics that begin to appear along some of the lineages, but not all of the lineages. We do have some lost characteristics. That's one way that I made this tree work. Um, Lost characteristics are not always ideal because they often involve you to make an extra step um, to depict the evolutionary history of a species or species that you're trying to show on an evolutionary tree. But it's not the end of the world. And eventually that gets us all the way out to species B, which I think is the most distant species from the outgroup, the most distantly related species from the outgroup, given the evidence that we have available to us. I've also tried to highlight some of the monophyletic groupings. So those are groupings that share a common ancestor, as well as the species that are derived from it. I put a blue box around one monophyletic grouping, and then another around a red monophyletic grouping, and I tried to illustrate a paraphyletic grouping with the green rectangle. The green rectangle shows species F and species D. They do share an ancestor, but by excluding species B, I'm only showing some of the descendants and not all, which makes that a paraphyletic group. Okay, so hopefully that is helpful there. If I go back to the answer key, I've also tried to take the three trees that you're asked to draw and simplify that down to just to one tree. So I did set up a character matrix, much like the first practice problem, and work through that. Again, your matrix may look a little bit different than mine based on the way that you interpreted those images. Heck, maybe even Googled additional images to help you fill out the table more completely. And then what I did down below was insert a Google drawing into the answer key, which shows one possible evolutionary tree. Again, probably not the simplest evolutionary tree. I wasn't able to completely eliminate the elimination of characteristics over the evolutionary history or on the tree for all of these species, but I think I got rid of most of them. And then when we begin to think about the two questions at the end of the lab handout, which of the hypotheses in part 4 is consistent with your analysis? Well, remember that you have two hypotheses that you're working with. Either males not feeding the young is an adaptation to dimorphism, so bright coloration, or if males don't feed the young in a species, it will allow them to become brightly colored. I'm going to favor the second hypothesis over the first hypothesis given my tree, and let me just show you why. So on my tree, I got to a point where if you were, sorry about the mouse here, see if I can fix this real quick. If you were feeding the young, so here's a characteristic in the case of the golden crown kinglet, you were not dimorphic. Now that actually makes sense, right? Because if you're brightly colored and you're a parent feeding the young, well, you're in essence signaling to predators that there might be food present, and that would especially be true if you had brightly colored plumage. So instead, I thought of the dimorphic trait emerging separately, when it wasn't appearing on a branch that also included the feeding of the young. Now, as I move up, I did get to a place where, at least for this final species, I think it's pronounced Pyrrholoxia, I do have the feed young trait, but that feed young trait actually belongs to the cedar waxwing and not to the Pyrrholoxia. So again, that same logic is applicable here, right? If you're feeding the young, you're not going to be sexually dimorphic. You're not going to have that brightly colored plumage. And if you don't feed the young, the dimorphic plumage is allowed to emerge. So I'm hoping this is helpful given the tree that I've created. Again, we're not trying to come up with a single answer. We're trying to come up with an answer that makes sense.